Assessing digital literacy in a way is not that different from assessing any other skill you might be teaching a learner. You want to find out where they are at the beginning, what they already know, what they don't know, what you need to cover. You want to make sure that they've got feedback to improve all the way through, and then you want some way of assessing at the end the distance travelled. The different types of assessment are focused on these different elements. So these are the four main types, and again these are the same as you'll find in other methods of assessment for other subjects. You've got initial assessment near the beginning, diagnostic assessment to drill down a bit deeper, formative assessment as they're going along, and then summative at the end. Some of these are going to be ongoing. It's important to have ongoing assessment so that learners can continue to develop, also so that they can see their progress and maintain motivation, and also so that they've got some way of proving what they've learned if they need to demonstrate it to somebody else. That might be an employer, it might be a higher course that they're going on to. So initial assessment is the first stage then. It's often either preceded or forms part of a screening process where you're trying to establish a very basic outline level of where somebody is, maybe just enough to know whether they're ready even to start this particular course to develop further. This is usually quite short. The one we use at the moment is only 10-20 minutes. And it's often semi-automated, electronic. With digital literacy I think the whole thing's going to be electronic, but it's a very brief screening. It doesn't give you very much detail, it just gives you a rough level of where they're starting from. Diagnostic assessment then builds on the initial assessment. Quite often these diagnostic assessments, which one you give depends on the level you got back during the initial assessment. Some electronic methods will automate that bit of the process for you. And what you find with diagnostic assessment, it goes into the topics a bit in more depth. It usually gives you some sort of chart or measure against the various syllabus standards or outcomes, and you tend to find that a lot of learners will have a spiky profile. They'll be very, very good at some bits and they'll have gaps or lower levels at another bit. So it enables you to plan a session, to plan for the whole group. You can compare these diagnostic assessments across the group. Find out where the common gaps are to learners and who might need particular catch-up materials on certain topics. Formative assessment then you'll be carrying out as you go through. This is going to be regular, informal, when you're watching learners work and just giving them verbal feedback. It might also be written feedback that you give on specific build-up activities, specific pieces of work that they've done through the course. It's a circular process. You tend to be giving them feedback on each task and hoping that the next task then they've acted on that feedback and they're not repeating the same errors over and over again. With some courses you will actually give the same piece of work back to be edited and improved on until it does meet the standard. That's been quite a common way of doing it. This can take a bit of time for the learners to get used to, really, if they've been used to school or college where you just get a mark and that's the end of it, good, bad or indifferent, and you move on. So it can be a bit of a learning curve. Summative assessment then is the end product. That might not be the end of the whole course, but it might be the end of a unit, the end of a particular project, things like that. So you would then have a task which they would complete. Sometimes this would be a portfolio, a finished copy of their portfolio. Sometimes it might be a test or exam, a discussion, an interview, a demonstration of their work. Whatever form it takes, it's the final piece of work. It's handed in. Once it's handed in, it's complete, and it shows how far they've travelled, what they've completed, what standards they've met. There's a whole variety of tools and methods, particularly when we're using electronic ones now. So we're going to have a look at each of those in turn. We're going to look more at the methods, and I'll talk with each method about a couple of tools that you can use to apply it. So portfolio for a long time has been the main method of assessment for ESW, and both key skills before it. The prior to that, this portfolio was alongside a multiple choice exam, but there was always a portfolio element. The advantages are it enables the learner to show realistic examples of their work, stuff that they maybe have produced in the workplace or have produced naturally during their course. So it could be quite authentic, quite realistic. The disadvantages are it's seen by some that repeated drafts and repeated incarnations weakens the evidence slightly. Perhaps they feel that learners maybe can There can be situations where they have too much guidance on it, goes through too many incarnations. The upside of that is, of course, that in the real world, that is the way it works. If the piece of work isn't right the first time, you do wind up doing it again. So it's got advantages and disadvantages. In a way, the opposite of a portfolio-based, continuous assessment-based summative assessment is the control task. The learners will call this a test or an exam. It can be stressful. Just the concept of sitting down to do something to a time limit is enough to make it feel like an exam to learners, and they may not have good experiences of that from their own educational history. However, it does have the advantage that you know for certain it's their work, you know for certain they can do it under pressure to a time limit, on the spot, from memory, and with their existing skills, rather than going back and forth with help and redrafting. Verbal assessment then, again, this is quite a nice authentic one because it's very hard for a learner to bluff, if you like, their way in a verbal assessment. If they can tell you it verbally, the odds are pretty good that they do actually know it, and they're not cribbing it from notes and looking things up and getting more help than they maybe should have on a summative assessment. It can be stressful for some learners, particularly if they're not used to it. They tend to be a bit off-put the first few times they do it, until they discover how much quicker it is, I tend to find, with my learners. As soon as they realise that it's a lot quicker to just explain something verbally than it is to write something up about it, then they suddenly become keen on it. But it is a good, authentic way of gathering, particularly theoretical knowledge, not so much the practical stuff, but the theoretical stuff, and giving the whys and wherefores of how they did a particular task. There's a variety of electronic tools you can use these days for assessment, from initial assessment via electronic questioning software. Diagnostic software will also give you quite detailed feedback these days in terms of at least those tasks that are theory driven. It's quite hard with an electronic tool. We find it with normal literacy to assess some of the things like the production of resources and the creating of things. But it's quite good for background theory. It will give you quite good detail. It also obviously reduces marking time. It enables you to just sit the learner in front of it and leave them get on with it, and you can come back to it afterwards. A lot of formative assessment is still verbal, is still based around questioning the learner and handing them written feedback on their work. We've started to use some electronic features for that. We sometimes use the Microsoft Word markup tools quite extensively. We use an e-portfolio system whereby there's a messaging system. You can give learners feedback on their work, they can resubmit, and it's all in line on the portfolio, so that's quite useful. Summative assessments, there is electronic exam software. It's got some limitations. It tends to be a bit literal in some cases. Things that would sometimes work in the real world don't always work on the simulated software, but we do use it. And then the more traditional exam format where they've got a written test paper and they crack on, but using electronic tools is also common. A lot of learners do find assessment stressful, particularly summative assessment and initial and diagnostic assessment, anywhere where they think they're being tested. Formative feedback tends to be more informal in some cases, and they also know that it's not the be-all and end-all, it's a step on the progress. So in order to make those bits of feedback, which can be stressful, less so, it's important that your assessment environment and the way you're approaching it is consistent and works well for the learner. In particular, you're looking for a positive learning environment. Learners should be absolutely aware and confident that the point of assessment is not to give them a laundry list of what they've got wrong, but it's to give them the tools and the knowledge to be able to improve on their work and know what they need to do next to get better. It's very, very difficult to convince learners of this during the initial and diagnostic stages. We find we do explain, we try and avoid the word test, exam, things like that, but the format of it is such that learners do interpret it that way. They have to sit down in a room with a bunch of other people. There's a timer, and they've got so long to answer some questions. It's very hard to make that not feel like an exam, but by keeping it positive, by stressing that there's no pass or fail, there's just information about which bits they are good at and which bits they need to work on, can help. It's also important that the assessment is planned, particularly summative assessments. It's important they're not just sprung on learners, that they do know when they're expected to do it by, what's expected to happen, making sure that they themselves have got as good an understanding as is possible for the learner of the standards they're required to meet. Standards aren't usually written in formats or wordings that are that easy for learners to understand, so it's important that the tutor takes the time to make sure that the learners do fully understand the standard in language that's suitable to them, and that they know what they're trying to achieve and by when. You'll usually have regular targets, regular reviews with targets on that should relate directly to their assessment, their initial assessment, their diagnostic assessment, and how they're filling in those gaps and improving those skills ready for the summative assessment at the end. The notion of collaboration in assessment is quite new. It used to be the case that it was considered very important that all of learners' work that was handed in was their own work, and they hadn't had input from anybody else, they hadn't had help from anybody else. Of course, now with digital literacy, the collaboration is actually a mandatory part of the whole thing, so it's going to be important to establish expectations with learners as to what to expect in terms of collaboration, what's going to be assessed, how their input is going to be assessed, how their response to feedback to other people is going to be assessed, and any concerns they might have about working in a group are dealt with up front and discussed. They also need to be given the tools to use collaborative techniques so that they can have the way of recording which bits were their input and which bits were other people's. So choosing the right tool that actually records the input from everybody is also going to be important. Keeping learners engaged, most tutors will probably tell you, is one of the bigger challenges with teaching digital literacy, particularly to younger learners who maybe feel that they already know a considerable portion of it, and with older learners who maybe have been asked to do it but aren't quite sure of the relevance. So it's important that learners are given the opportunity to focus their digital literacy around interests to them. So if you are practicing looking something up on the internet, searching, things like that, allowing learners to make some choices about what it is that they're looking up and acting on, giving a variety of applications, giving people sufficient time to play with things and get confident with them. Becoming familiar with new applications does take a certain amount of confidence to poke it and see what happens, and encouraging that attitude and that idea, that mindset within learners is an important thing to keep them engaged, keep them interested and keen to learn, as opposed to overwhelmed by the amount of the content will be important. Making sure the assessments are accessible for everybody is obviously very important. There's quite a lot of legislation around access to assessment and equality, and making sure that everybody has equal access. That goes both for disabilities that learners may have, and the tools and the techniques you use to work around these. They've probably got some of their own that they prefer to use, and a lot of mobile technology does have good accessibility options, although not always to the physical level that maybe desktop applications do. But there's other things as well as physical disabilities. There's things like dyslexia that learners may have. There's things like that underpin digital literacy, such as skimming and scanning skills, for example. If you are doing a web searching activity, you need those activities as well. The ability to produce evidence in a written format can be a challenge for some learners, and that's somewhere where mobile technology and recording audio and multimedia can really make a big difference to those learners. Individual awarding bodies will have their own access to assessment requirements as well. You might need to put in advance, if you're submitting things in a different format, you might need to apply to your awarding body beforehand if learners need particular help. So just being aware of the own requirements within your own organisation and set by your own awarding bodies is also important. Ultimately, it's important to keep in mind the main purpose of the assessment, whatever tools or methods you use, is to give the learner sufficient information that they can get better at what they're doing and they can improve their work, that they can look at their own work realistically, know what's good and bad about it, what needs to be improved, and make those changes to improve their learning.